Now, Eddie Slowey, you were chief engineer. When did you join the service, Eddie?
I joined in about 1936 as a station engineer in the studios.
Yes, I was told you were here tonight as the spy, Eddie. You did some spying. What was all that about? Now, it's very tangled in my mind.
I hardly call it spying, but in the war years, at the start of the war years, there naturally were a number of security precautions, and I found myself having 3 different secret tasks, of which I was told not to breathe a word to anybody else. And the great trouble was that I was worried which of the tasks should have priority. And any time I would go to talk to my immediate boss, he would say, I don't want to know anything about that. That's somebody else's business. And I had the great fear that, apart from the normal fear of invasion, what I was going to do if the Germans did eventually arrive in the country, because I had several of these rather mutually incompatible secret jobs.
And what were these secret jobs?
Well, I suppose now, I mean, that's 30 or 40 years ago, it can be told. One of them was that this was started shortly after the invasion of Norway, I think, at the beginning of 1940, and the King of Norway had to leave Oslo and take to the hills, so to speak, and it was feared, of course, that if Ireland was invaded, and Dave was Taoiseach at the time, that, of course, Dublin would be a prime target, and that he would have to try and escape out of Dublin with some of his entourage, and it was considered very important that he should be in contact with the people and the country and that sort of thing. So it was decided that a small transmitter would be built and kept in Deb's house out in Blackrock. And the idea was that if Dublin was taken, that he, with a couple of his entourage, would take to certain secret rendezvous, and the actual transmission would take place from the small transmitter to the main transmitter at Athlone and be rebroadcast. And it meant that each week I got the job of putting this transmitter out in his house, and we had to rehearse this every week or every fortnight with Dev himself. I remember the very first time, a very rather amusing thing, because naturally Dev was a very august and fearsome figure to us as young engineers, and we were asked to go out to his house at lunchtime, and that we would explain what was to be done, and he would make a mock broadcast and the sort of thing. And we went out in great fear and trepidation. It was another engineer, he's dead since, Jack Lyons, who had a terrible stutter. And when we knocked on the door of his house, we expected a maid or something to open it. Instead of that, Dave opened it himself. And neither of us had much Irish. I Portadown man, etc. And so when he opened, he said something like, Taras Jock, you see. And this threw us back completely. I didn't know what the appropriate reply was. And Jack Lyons' mouth just opened and he couldn't utter a word. So anyway, we were ushered in, and Deb was very pleasant to us and that sort of thing. So we got the thing hooked up and so forth. And then the usual way engineers count 1, 2, 3, 4 and that sort of thing. We went testing the microphone, you see. So then we said to the Taoiseach, you better read something into it to get, you see. So there was nothing around to read, and I happened to have stuffed the Irish Times of the particular time in my pocket. I think it was the Irish Times. And I pulled it out and turned some page of it over and handed it to Deb to read, you see. And I was twiddling with the knobs and wasn't really following what was said, but I noticed that Jack Lyons was getting more and more purple. So suddenly I realized that, in fact, it was a criticism. It was I had taken out the editorial, and it was a criticism of Deb, and here Deb was reading it out. So a smile came over his face because he could see the great embarrassment that we were in. And he just smiled. And I remember when we got out of the house, Jack Lance recovered the speech, and I might say he recovered it all the way back to the GPO, because what the devil did they mean by, could they not have thought of something else? So
But
that
Eddie,
was our first meeting.
Eddie, you bugged telephones as well.
Oh, well, as one would realise, of course, now, the whole thing is very common, but at the beginning of the war, the question of security and this sort of thing loomed large, and it was actually John O'Keefe, who was at that time staff engineer, was asked to design a device which could be, let's call it, plugged into a telephone, but which could be detected by the public or anybody on it. So he did this very successfully. And during the war years, naturally, a number of key telephones were tapped from time to time. I was pulled in on
Which key telephones were they?
Well,
here's the official Secrets Act gone for a Burton now. We're all in trouble. You're not prepared to stay.
I'm not retired yet.